Africa is the richest continent on Earth. Not was, is 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 60% of its uncultivated farmland, more genetic diversity than the rest of the planet combined. And yet today, it holds the largest concentration of poverty anywhere in the world. That didn't happen by accident. For 400 years, European powers carved up the continent, extracted its wealth, and drew borders with rulers and pencils that ignored every ethnic, linguistic, and geographic reality on the ground. But what if none of that ever happened? What if the scramble for Africa never took place and the continent was left to develop on its own terms? This isn't a story about what Africa could have become from nothing. Africa wasn't a blank slate. Before colonization, the continent was home to some of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. The Mali Empire controlled more gold than any kingdom on earth. Mansa Musa, its emperor, was so wealthy that, when he passed through Cairo in 1324, he gave away so much gold that he crashed Egypt's economy for a decade. The Congo Kingdom had centralized governance, a court system, and international diplomacy. Great Zimbabwe was a stone city that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. Ethiopia had been a Christian empire for centuries. These weren't primitive societies waiting to be saved. They were evolving powers on their own trajectory. One of colonialism's most devastating legacies was the borders. European diplomats in Berlin in 1884 divided the continent into territories that had nothing to do with who actually lived there. They split ethnic groups across multiple countries and forced rival groups into single nations. The result? Centuries of conflict. But without colonization, Africa's borders would have formed organically, along rivers, mountain ranges, and ethnic territories. The Yoruba would have their own state. The Zulu nation wouldn't be a cultural memory, it would be a country. Instead of 54 nations drawn by foreigners, you'd see perhaps 200 smaller, more culturally coherent states, or a handful of massive empires that consolidated power naturally. Would Africa have industrialized without Europe? Almost certainly, but differently. West Africa had iron smelting technology 1,000 years before Europe's Industrial Revolution. The question isn't whether Africans could build, they already were. Without the slave trade draining an estimated 12 million people from the continent and colonialism extracting raw materials without building local industry, African kingdoms would have developed manufacturing on their own timeline. It might have looked different. Less coal-powered, more water and wind-driven, shaped by local geography. But the industrial output would have come. And unlike Europe's version, it wouldn't have required colonies to fuel it. In our timeline, Africa's lingua francas are English, French, and Portuguese languages imposed by colonizers. Without colonization, Swahili would likely be the dominant trade language of East and Central Africa, spoken by hundreds of millions. Hausa would dominate West Africa's Sahel region. Amharic would remain the diplomatic language of the Horn. Arabic would still influence the north. And writing systems like Giez, Ensibiti, and Vai script would have evolved into standardized national alphabets. Imagine a continent where every child learns in their ancestral language first, where knowledge isn't filtered through a colonial lens. That's not just cultural pride. That's cognitive advantage. Africa's trade networks were already global before Europeans arrived. The Swahili coast traded with China, India, and Persia for centuries. Trans-Saharan routes moved gold, salt, and textiles across thousands of miles. Without colonial extraction redirecting all resources to European ports, these networks would have matured. African merchants would have controlled their own commodities. Gold from West Africa would be processed into finished goods locally, not shipped raw to London. Diamonds from southern Africa would fund African infrastructure, not European crowns. The continent's natural wealth would compound internally, creating an economic engine that rivals anything in Asia or Europe. Let's be honest, a colonization-free Africa wouldn't be a utopia. Empires expand. Borders shift. Wars happen. The Zulu expansion, the Fulani jihads, the wars between the Ashanti and their neighbors, these conflicts existed before any Europeans set foot on the continent. But there's a crucial difference. When African states fought each other, they eventually negotiated, merged, or established stable borders. Colonialism froze these natural processes, then shattered them. Without it, Africa would have its conflicts, but they'd be its own conflicts, resolved on its own terms, producing its own stable order. In this alternate 2026, Africa isn't the world's charity case. It's the world's fastest-growing economic bloc. Its combined GDP rivals China's. Its universities lead in tropical medicine, agricultural science, and renewable energy. Its cities Timbuktu, Great Zimbabwe, Mombasa, Kano are global destinations. The African Union isn't a diplomatic afterthought. It's the most powerful trade organization on Earth, backed by a continent that controls 30% of the world's natural resources and processes them domestically. There's no brain drain because there's no reason to leave. The best opportunities in the world are right here. The hardest part of this thought experiment isn't imagining what Africa could have built. It's reckoning with what was taken. The slave trade didn't just remove 12 million people. It removed 12 million engineers, farmers, artists, leaders, and mothers. Colonialism didn't just draw bad borders. It systematically dismantled systems of governance that had worked for centuries. It replaced local innovation with dependence on imported goods. It told an entire continent that its history didn't matter. But history always matters. And the Africa that exists today despite everything is still building, still innovating, still rising. The question isn't really what if Africa was never colonized. The question is what's possible now that the world finally sees what was always there.